Hi, this is Paul. Some of you might have noticed already that I'm playing around with 24-hour streams. What do you mean? My sister did on her channel, use different things. I have an enormous back catalog of conversations. Randos conversations, times they're called. That what they fundamentally are pastoral conversations. People they became sort of on ramped to the TLC. And so my sister was playing around with 24-hour streams. I didn't want to get a service, so I set up a one of the computers here in my office. I just set that up to run it, and then chatting with my sister, and she's like, "Yeah, but the service, you have to pay like a certain amount a month for certain services. You have to re-render your videos to a certain frame rate and all." And I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to play with it because I really don't know what's going to happen with this. So I'm just playing around with it. But it's one of the things I noticed right away was that it does become sort of a way for people to gather in chat section, hive mind. Anselman's sort of holding forth theologically right now, which is wonderful to see. And Anselman is Anselman's like my number one get in terms of a those conversation that I want to do. Anselman, day the day you can keep the camera off, I'm totally fine with that. But the day you want to sit and share your story, I want to be there because Anselman has been here pretty much from the beginning. So it's just running on the channel. I don't know how long I'm gonna run it. I don't know if I'm gonna run it episodically. I'm just playing around with it. So what I've really enjoyed are there's so much good stuff in those old conversations. I look at the amount of them that I did. It was just astounding. I mean, that's part of the reason I had to cut back because I was doing 3 a day. I just had a flood of requests. I still have a flood of requests, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with all the requests because I usually have up to 2 hours now for one, and I still am trying to get my mind around it. But there was a certain there was something going on at that period, and so to play these, I like them because I can just kind of drop in and listen to a snippet of one at random and usually come away with, "Oh, that was, oh, I remember him," and, "Oh, yeah, I remember that," and, "Oh, that was good." Job's Reese's Pieces to Jesus, um, video we just played. I'm gonna have to continue to play with it because most of the Zoom recordings all have the same size, but some of them are a little different, and so if I just leave this thing running, there'll be some interesting things that show up on but, I had that I had some Freddie and Paul shows in there too, but the Freddie and Paul shows are sort of kind of all over, so I might have to do some. It's it's like everything else here, it's what I play with. This video dropped, and I wanna sort of start with this one because assessing the ministry of Tim Keller. Tim Keller's ministry has come under sort of a reassessment. There was already one in terms of his politics, and now after Charlie Kirk, these are these are the these are the Theopolis guys. James Wood teaches at Redeemer. I've long wanted to do a Randos conversation with him. I really should. I've just been so busy, and I'm looking ahead to November and December, and I'm doing more travel. And then with vacations, I usually don't plan Randos conversations while my wife is on vacation because we get chances to sort of get away a little bit, and so I don't want to hem those in, and we have family time then. So yeah, it's gonna be the I don't know what to do. And what's so much fun is watching those old videos, and I just had time. I mean, I just had time, and it was great. And I know Jess and others knew right away. You find even some of the not. I'm trying to be very careful to only post um conversations that people gave me permission. I do have some recorded um that people didn't want. I'm careful not to share those. But uh, let's so Tim Keller. Tim Keller was very important to these two men, and James Wood as his critique. But Colin Hansen really opened up with some good stuff, and so I kind of want to start there.
Thanks for the warm welcome here in my hometown, Birmingham. Third Pres. Thanks, James, for participating in this as well. So, the last time I saw Tim Keller in person was the end.
This is Colin Hansen. He's the vice president of the Gospel Coalition. He's written a lot about Tim Keller. He's one of sort of the go-to guys um, with all things Keller.
End of 2019. A few months later, the COVID-19 pandemic shut down much of the world, and a few more months later, he revealed that he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, from which he died in May of 2023. Keller gave little time to worrying about his own legacy. In that last meeting, Keller talked to me about how a new generation would need their own methods to share the gospel. Manhattan was already secular and post-Christian when he arrived in the 1980s. But in the 2010s, he observed how youth were growing up without the architecture of religious awareness. God, sin, guilt, law, salvation had become foreign concepts. It would be,
and it's not just foreign concepts. Children don't know what reverence is because they're never in a place where there's just sort of a hushed silence. And when I was growing up, there were reverence of a variety of strains. And today, many children, they're never in a scene or a place that requires reverence of any kind.
It's safe to suppose that in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s that Keller had solved some kind of problem, and all Christians would need to do is replicate his formula. In fact, for almost 20 years, Keller had been calling for a deeper rethinking of Christian ministry amid spreading secularism. Keller didn't even become well known until 2008 when he published the first two of his best-selling books. But at the Desiring God 2006 National Conference, he observed a crisis for evangelism due to our changing cultural situation. It was 17 years later that we launched the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics to continue working on a problem that Keller did not believe that we had yet solved.
I've never really done my video about Tim Keller. I know CW really wants me to do one. I met Keller in 2006. One of our Sacramento cluster guys, Tim Blackman, had a connection, and Tim Keller's was basically pastoring in relative obscurity, and his church was fairly small until 9/11. And 9/11 sort of put a religious shock into New York City. And from 9/11, his church grew. And suddenly, Keller had an audience. I'd heard of Tim Keller actually in Calvin Seminary because Roger Greenway, I've never had Scott on the channel either. Scott's Roger's son. Roger Greenway was pulled back from Westminster to teach missions at Calvin Seminary. I was a student at Calvin Seminary when Roger Greenway was there. And I remember once he passed out a piece of paper with something that Tim Keller had written. And I remember he told us, so this was in the 80s, he told us, you're going to hear about this guy, Tim Keller. And he was right. But we really didn't hear about him. Well, I found Tim Keller in 2006 when myself and the other guys from our Sacramento cluster could go to New York and basically have this tiny little conference that Tim and some of the Redeemer staff did, where we just had really open access to them, asking questions. They gave some lectures. They talked about what they were doing. And it was actually, at that point, I was much more into N.T. Wright. At that point, after the conference, after the conference, a couple months after the conference, I was really burning out. And there were some things in my life that were really hitting some walls. And I needed something. And at that point in 2006, it was really sort of like September, October 2006, I started downing large amounts of Tim Keller. I would listen to 2-3 sermons a day. And James Wood talks about the fact that in 2008, that's when Keller just starts going viral. And there were these websites on the internet that had all of these MP3s that were out there sort of spread around the internet. And I actually, with another guy, sort of managed a Tim Keller website and wiki so that people could find these little MP3s all over the internet, because when a new one arose, he did a talk somewhere, he'd grab that MP3, link it, and then I'd download it. And that's really before YouTube became. And then Redeemer was charging for their sermons, but I didn't care. They were like $2.50 a one. I was, like I said, I was listening to 2 to 5 hours of Tim Keller a day, and I needed it. And listening to Tim Keller just really, I really need, and I needed it for a number of years. By about 2012, I was sort of past that, and so I wasn't listening to as much Keller, and then I was just sort of reading broadly, and of course, it was 2017 that I found um, Peterson, and then of course I went into the Peterson deep dive, played around with YouTube, and that's where all of this has happened. The video should be fine again. OBS updated. I tried it with a different camera and it worked fine. So then I put my old camera back on there. It's still working fine. So it should resolve the issues. I've had this issue before with OBS gets an update and so forth. So let's keep going, because I think Hanson's opening statement here is just astounding, and I'm still at the point of Wood's statement, but I was super impressed by Hanson's opening statement.
How to foster spiritual revival in the post-Christendom West. Arguing about Keller's legacy and his alleged failures often proves his very point. We have not yet solved the problem of secularism following the collapse of Christendom in the West, combined with the loss of social solidarity following the collapse of the Enlightenment. We're not going to solve those problems unless together we can move past superficial evaluations of culture and ministry. The 20th century is...
Now, I've been reading Alan Jacobs in the Year of Our Lord, 1943. Super interesting book. All of these intellectuals basically dealing with similar issues. And of course, Lewis had been grappling with it. Keller was a huge Lewis and Tolkien fan. I don't think we think our way out of this. It's not that kind of thing. We have to live our way through this. And I'm going to get to a video that I think is really helpful. But in terms of YouTube, we can share the thinky-talky stuff, and we need that. But again, I think we will live our way through this, not think our way out of this.
Historian Fernand Braudel, in his seminal 1972 work, The Mediterranean World, described history as layered like the sea. The deepest layer is slow and repetitive. In historical terms, think about seismic shifts like industrialization and the great economic leap forward in the 18th century. The middle level of this historical sea is social history, rhythms, tides coming in and out. The third level, or surface, in historical terms, that comprises individuals who shape history, like the foam that's riding across the waves. Think then in historical and cultural terms like musicians, politicians who direct trends that don't change the underlying cultural conditions. What we need then, in light of Keller's legacy, is a race to the bottom. That is, to the deepest layers of cultural change, because that's the level of the problem that we face today across the West. The tide or vibes, they ebb and flow. The waves or politicians, they rise and fall. The conditions of secularism rest dark, quiet, and cold on the bottom of Western culture. We need a unified effort, humble, thoughtful, and prayerful, to learn these conditions and how they might become more favorable to saving faith. The last time I spoke with Keller was the month before his death. It was the first meeting of the Keller Center's Fellows. We'll meet again next week in New York City. And in this meeting, Keller was commending early drafts of James Davison Hunter's 2024 book, Democracy and Solidarity. More than anyone else, Hunter taught his friend Keller about the deep structures of culture. Hunter explains in that book, I've got a few quotes here I'll be reading throughout, culture at its deepest level is the implicit order underneath the apparent order of things, and it typically manifests itself as the unspoken rules, schemas, and resources that organize the overall forms of linguistic and, by extension, cultural expression and practice.
I like the fact that he has layers. When I think about this universal for freedom religion that is pervasive in our culture, and it is a religious layer. And then, well, how does so I talk about that as a religion, I talk about Christianity, and so the fact is all of these things sort of work together. And I like what he does here in terms of these various layers.
Across his writings, Keller expressed deep concern over the decline of Western culture and the eclipse of classical liberalism. Indeed, Keller described value-neutral liberalism as failed. Informed by Hunter, Keller wrote this in one of his last books, published in 2022. The result of the individualism of the Enlightenment is the decline of all human communities, institutions, neighborhoods, and families, leading to greater isolation, loneliness, anomie, anxiety, and depression. But as the percentage of the population going to church declined, and as the radical individualism of the West became more pervasive, the original Enlightenment vision of a society based on secular human reason alone came largely to pass. But it has not led to unity at all. Western society in general, and U.S. society in particular, are polarized, fragmented, and ungovernable as everyone adopts their own meaning in life and moral values. Keller lamented that the Enlightenment liberalism sawed off the branch that it was sitting on. Quote, the polarization in our society has become severe, and the disagreements are about the most basic ideas of what human nature is and what human flourishing looks like. Thank you. There is no longer any common set of American values or a unifying American story. Keller saw Christianity as the cure for renewing a truly pluralistic society, but not through Christian dominance of political power, and certainly not through any compromise with left or right-wing versions of identity politics, reminiscent of the paganism Christianity supplanted millennia ago. Indeed, Keller resisted the rise of identity in directing party politics. After the fall of Christendom and church, the church retains tremendous influence, especially in a few Bible Belt holdouts and even at the national level. But we should not confuse the waves and tides for the depth. Keller warned, there seem to be times of backlash when political conservatism does better in elections against liberals or progressives. But increasingly, those conservatives are themselves adopting secular approaches to the self, or embracing the secular ideologies of individualism or racial identitarianism, focusing on Anglo-white identity rather than multiculturalism. In other words, the Christian worldview continues to retreat, and the Christian church continues to decline and weaken, even when political conservatism does better. Now, behind this analysis, you will find Hunter, who argues that American political culture, left and right, runs on the fuel of outrage. He writes, quote, identity groups become so deeply attached to their own impotence, exclusion, and subordination because they provide the premises upon which the group's existence depends. Take away the injury, take away its cause, take away the revenge it seeks, and both meaning and identity for the aggrieved dissolve. In short, if the identity group were ever to succeed, the group would disintegrate. Hence, the group built on grievance perpetuates that very grievance.
And that is so important. And it basically links up with Jonathan Peugeot's argument about the parasitic nature of so much of the culture that we're developing. These politics and religions and cultures of grievance are all dependent on that which they are complaining about. You take that away, it goes away. In other words, by winning, it's done. It reaches its eschatology.
Grievance to the detriment of themselves in society at large. Hunter explains, quote, "The cultural logic of ressentiment can bring about symbolic victories, but they tend to be self-defeating. They deplete and exhaust rather than renew and refresh public life and democratic politics. A culture and politics of ressentiment simply cannot heal wounds, and it cannot bring about a just reckoning. Against what could very well be legitimate claims against injustice, ressentiment ultimately denies the possibility of a public life as shared project, for there is nothing in this that requires or even encourages a person or group or organization to seek the consent of others." This kind of politics will not protect our society from dissolving in the aftermath of Christendom and the Enlightenment. We need a source of solidarity that appeals to our better angels by warning us about our inner demons. We need leaders who are, in Hunter's words, learned, principled, courageous, and humble, embodied in the lives lived sacrificially toward the realization of that vision. This kind of leadership would have to be prepared to be ignored, then dismissed as naive, and then despised by the main partisans who would ultimately see its exemplars as a threat to their interests. As a pastor primarily concerned with the health of the church, Keller championed both special and common grace. That is, the work of evangelism, as well as the work of service for our neighbors, regardless of their belief. Identity politics hurts both causes. As Keller predicted and practiced himself, polemics are sometimes necessary, but they are medicine, not food. You can't live on medicine. In the long run, constant polemics are exhausting, and
That, of course, is a C.S. Lewis thing. And Keller just always was borrowing from.
don't build us up spiritually. The movement that will succeed, that becomes the most famous for preaching and writing and teaching and pastoring, that is astonishingly good and that spiritually nourishes and changes the readers or listeners right in their seats. This is not a...
Okay, that's Keller. And Keller's evangelistic MO was get them in the church and convert them in their seats. I'm not gonna say anything against that. But I suspect that there are whole ranges of people for whom that won't work. And that is why I think when we get to the next video that I'm going to play, we are, again, I've talked about this before. The Orthodox are like the liturgy, the liturgy, the liturgy. Catholics are the Eucharist, the Eucharist, the Eucharist. Protestants are the preaching of the word, the preaching of the word, the preaching of the word. I think we're coming into the communion of the saints. And now the Orthodox have the preaching of the word. Orthodox have the Eucharist. The Orthodox have the communion of the saints. All of the segments of the church have all the things. But their priorities. And I think, as he said earlier on, what's happening now here with our time is that it's the crisis of the individual. Individuality is the crisis. I've said before, the first dollar someone spends tends to be towards privacy. And increasingly, their dollars are going to be spent towards AI sex, AI companionship. And it's going to be getting away from people. And as they retreat from human beings, their capacity to actually engage productively with human beings is going to decrease. Kindergarten and first grade teachers they're used to seeing separation anxiety from mommy or dad. Now they're seeing separation anxiety from iPads. That is what is happening increasingly in our schools. That's only going to accelerate. And just as I said at Midwestuary, I think we are going to increasingly see a divide in the culture between families that actually raise their children as human beings and children that are raised by the screens and the machines.
Third way, between left and right, this is following the way, the truth, and the life, Jesus Christ. Good, and that spiritually nourishes and changes the readers or listeners right in their seats. This is not a third way between left and right. This is following the way, the truth, and the life, Jesus Christ. Because Jesus is risen from the dead, we are optimistic about what God is doing in the world, even at the deepest, darkest levels of our culture. But because Jesus has not yet returned, we are pessimistic because we know the creation remains subjected to futility under sin. Romans 8:20. The flow that we see in our culture will ebb once more, yet we know with all confidence that Jesus is coming quickly. Revelation 22:12. He is the hope who holds all things together. Hebrews 1:3. Keller wrote, "We believe Christianity is relevant to society because it is true. It is not true because it is relevant. Christians do not believe in and promote the faith because it brings so much hope, though it..."
Luke had a great live stream this morning. Another rando came out of the lurk, but it engaged in that relevance thing, and I thought Phlebas made an excellent point. And Sherry, of course, was talking about eternity, as was Jordan Hall in that tweet that we dealt with on the Friday morning live stream a few weeks ago.
Does, or because it fills you with joy, though it will, or because it creates deep and strong community, though it can, or because it can heal our society of many ills, though it might. Rather, Christians seek renewal of the church as a way to love and serve the one who saved us. There is a great need for a new Christian church movement that practices love and justice, that equips its members to do enormous good in society, yet at the same time resists the forces seeking to make it a political instrument, that speaks to and answers the great questions of the human heart and of the human race, of purpose, meaning, hope, happiness, guilt, and forgiveness, identity, questions to which the secular culture cannot speak as powerfully. Some may dismiss this church movement as naive. Its leaders may be despised by identity-branded politicians and partisans. Maybe their efforts will be ignored by the broader world, even by other Christians. This kind of church can endure the deeper challenges of the cultural crisis we face after Christendom, after the Enlightenment. This kind of church, because it's based in Scripture, empowered by the Spirit, and ruled by Christ, can even become the catalyst for an unexpected, mighty movement of God in our day. It is the kind of church that Keller labored to build, and it is the legacy he has left for us to advance under God. Thank you.
I thought that was a tremendous opening statement, and I thought he dealt with a bunch of things. Now, the link to this video is below. I'd encourage you to go ahead and watch it. I'm going to watch the whole thing. I expect, I was appreciating James Wood's opening statement too. It wasn't as polished as Colin Hansen's was, but I'm really anticipating good things from this video. But I want to get to another video that was outstanding. Andrew Sweeney was an early rando. He lived in France. He identifies as a Buddhist, but he had this video. He had this video with Jordan Hall, because two of the guys were new to me, even though one of them actually leaves comments. Luke, oh, let's just have him. This was a great conversation.
For a few reasons, I think Jordan has just recently publicly in general. So why the world hates Christianity. So I'm not a Christian. I guess it doesn't matter. But I'm not sure if Daniel's a Christian. I asked Jordan because he was the first person I thought of for a few reasons. I think Jordan has just recently publicly converted, and he also has a lot to say, I think, about society in general, and is one of the more pertinent commentators on what's going on, kind of. So, and then Luke, of course, has done several courses with Parallax. He's my close friend, and we do Gurdjieff discussion groups together at Parallax, and he's written a book, exploring Gurdjieff and Christianity. So anyway, welcome, gentlemen, and perhaps I'll just begin, I guess, with Luke, with the course and the question and the query, which is why Why is there this hatred, let's say, or strong, powerful kind of reaction to Christianity? Go ahead, Lee.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, and nice to see you, gentlemen. Yeah, why do a course on why the world hates Christianity? Well, in a sense, the question was trying to move past the politics and culture wars and all the institutional stuff that's happened over the years with the various churches and other bits and pieces. Really trying to get out of the weeds and to see something a little bit more clearly, something at the level of energies and forces, what was unleashed 2,000 years ago. And so there's this real question.
Now, this is a hour and 45-minute conversation. I don't have an hour and 45-minute conversation for me to actually comment on. The entire video would probably take 4 to 5 hours, and I don't have 4 to 5 hours. So I will have to jump around and hit some things, which is fine. One of the thoughts that I did have in this was one of the interesting aspects of the move towards Orthodoxy, Catholicism, in some cases, some version of Anglicanism, is a reinstitutioning and a rechurching, because you cannot be Orthodox or Catholic or Anglican without embracing a heavy dosage of church as institution. And part of what I noticed in this video is you have a strong, and when I say a strong Protestant undercurrent, I don't mean that it's ostensibly Protestant, but part of what's behind Protestantism is a degree of skepticism about the supremacy of the church as institution. And it's for that reason that while I see people going to Orthodoxy and Catholicism, I have deep wonderings, because I wonder what degree, especially with Orthodoxy and Catholicism, do they use it as a Eucharistic service provider? Because you can go to the Orthodox or the Catholic Church and get your Eucharist, you'll get your liturgy, you'll get your beauty. You're not going to get much in terms of the church service. You're not going to necessarily get much didactic formation. And what I've also seen and heard from many is that some of these churches, not all, because I've heard some real stories of especially some of these new small Orthodox churches in North America. I think partly because so many people are sort of in the stage um, time of their conversion, that there's real good fellowship, and I certainly want to praise that. My conversation with Nick from the Bay Area, who's going to a monastery up in Northern California, I mean, he's experiencing where you have the community that's actually living together. So I think some new Orthodox churches are really moving into that, but there's something that happens in time to churches, just like the first dollar people spend is to their privacy. After a while, especially if churches are of a certain size, it's the same dynamic that happens in a big city, where you want to get in, get what you want, get what you need, and get out. And this kind of real community doesn't necessarily form. Let's jump ahead.
Maybe it's at the point of death, who knows? But there is this sense that something changed in history. Of course, we're all used to it now, so it's been a long time, but something remarkable changed. something was infused that none of us can escape from. And so how do we deal with it? And it must catalyze in some way. It must reach a critical mass. It must affect everything and everyone. So what does that mean? The parousia. Maybe there is something that needs to reach a boiling point, and we all feel that in some way, shape, or form. Anyway, there's just that sense there at the fundamental level. It's not just the level of ideas or a message or something to grapple with, but there's something.
And that's why, again, I say we're not going to think our way through this or beyond it. We're going to fail our way. We're going to fail our way through it. And even in our failure, Christ will reign.
Coming up against us in the being that everybody has.
Let me throw 3 more logs in the fire. One is the problem that the church by necessity must always fail. This obviously is going to create a continuous experience of, at the very least, annoyance. But it's critical to recognize the church of necessity must always fail. That's very problematic. And that connects down to the micro level, which is that, and every individual will also by necessity fail. This is not the kind of thing where you're going to figure it out or you're going to win on your own. Right? That's kind of one of the key elements. Even to and you get these very sticky things. So if, like, we talk about this idea of like voluntary suffering, and then the artificial assumption of, you kind of put on the Christ Halloween costume and go walk around with your styrofoam cross, and you're like, yes, I'm suffering voluntarily. And like, nope, even in fact, and particularly not that. And so you as an individual will always fail. The people around you who are endeavoring to be in discipleship will always fail. And the church in general will always fail. And it will fail sometimes in a fashion.
This is such an important point. Now, you have to understand what he means by fail. And this is, I when he was saying this, I was thinking, I remember when I made a point at a classis meeting about, I made exactly this point. Some of the other pastors weren't happy with it. But this is what happens in the age of decay. But there's something that happens through the failure. I mean, it's the eucatastrophe of the cross. Something happens, and then it's the resurrection. But Jesus doesn't use the, like I've said this before, Jesus doesn't use the resurrection to go knock on Pilate's door and say, how do you like me now? Go knock on Caesar's door and say, you wanted to do a trick? What do you think about this trick right here? I'm standing in front of you. You killed me. I'm alive. Go ahead, touch the wounds, see what happens. Jesus doesn't do that. And so Jesus uses a certain kind of failure. The church is always failing, always dying, but always rising, always failing, but never dead.
Which is relatively lightweight. Sometimes it'll fail in a fashion which is somewhat catastrophic. And so, of course, this is a very difficult thing because we look at the world. Isn't that funny? Like, we look at the world as a way of getting an evidence of what's happening. So when we want to see Christ, we can't help but look at the church and think that we're seeing Christ. And since the church by necessity must always fail, we then get this powerful tension, which is part of the boiling point. And then the third piece, and this just landed on me when Luke mentioned that it happened 2,000 years ago, which is we live in Babylon right now. We currently live in Babylon. In spite of the fact that this thing entered the world 2,000 years ago and didn't do nothing, it actually did a tremendous amount. Nonetheless, Babylon continues to burble forth, and our participation continues to go through this process of denaturing. We find a way to produce an idol by hook or by crook until eventually we've migrated once again to being idol worshippers. You can pick your poison with the current flavor of that looks like. And then, of course, the pressure of metanoia is just pressing on us tremendously. You can imagine maybe 50 years ago how agonizing that would have been to say, hey, aren't we actually in a triumphant Christian civilization that has at long last defeated the forces of darkness and is delivering on the promises of Christ in the world in every direction? And yet No, no, you're actually living in Babylon, and and therefore the presence of heaven is even more intense upon you.
No, that's very, very well put. Well, if a few things come to mind. First off, on that idea.
Now, I'd seen that OG Rose. I was like, that before, and someone mentioned. So he and his wife, this is a shared account that he and his wife have, and I've done a little bit of digging since I saw him. He's a super interesting guy. So maybe we'll have him on the channel. But he was following me already on Twitter, so he knows something of what's been going on, and he's clearly doing some really interesting Christian ministry. So fascinating guy.
Of suffering. If I told you, hey, suffering is good for you, you would naturally say that's really dumb. Unless perhaps you're born after Jesus and you have this kind of idea that actually there is something to the suffering servant that actually tapped you into a way of being that otherwise was not afforded, or maybe you were an athlete and so lifting weights and so on was good. But you see, what's very interesting, like Michelle and I talk about this all the time, if you don't have the possibility that suffering has some sort of gain, versus the social scripts of going to the gyms and all, doing all these things, which are in the script of suffering, right? That's kind of different. But the suffering that seems arbitrary, like, for example, you could every time you feel uncomfortable, take a pill. You could, every time it's too cold, turn on the heat. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you do that, right? Unless for some reason you have an idea that suffering should not always be resisted or technologically removed or something like that, right? But everyone around you might just think you're stubborn or dumb or so on and so forth. And one of the things that's just very important is, I think, if there's no possibility of there being some, I don't want to say irrational, but non-rational, which is an important category for me, non-rational gain, a gain that cannot be put into a rational calculus before it is experienced. If there's no possibility of a non-rational gain from suffering, then you're basically stuck, like the little mouse in that Kafka story that's in a hole and it can't turn around, in the technological essence, as Heidegger would say, or the utility, just get rid of suffering, just get rid of suffering. And then you find yourself like that little mouse somewhere you don't want to go. And I do think basically we're in the age of Kafka more than Orwell and Huxley, although of course there's truth to all of these because all of Kafka's novels are about protagonists, well, except the investigation of a dog. They're stuck with their very mode of consciousness is what leads them to imprisonment. They just, by their very logic of how they're supposed to react, go deeper and deeper and deeper into something that they can't get out of. And there's something in Jesus that unveiling, actually, there's something to suffering. There's something to being not understood. There's something to being actually perhaps even rejected by the religious leaders of your day that actually open up new possibilities that if you were just doing what was, say, logical or rational or practical, you would never escape. Oh, and then worse yet, you wouldn't know you were entrapped either, because if you're entrapped, you don't know you're entrapped. It's like Kierkegaard said that the man who's in despair doesn't know they're in despair, because once you know you're in despair, you can start to move out of it, right? Like if you don't know something, you also don't know something. And so there's this entrapment logic that's always in operation that one has to perpetually guard against. But then how do you even know you need to guard against it, right? And so, when I hear Jordan mentioning Babylon, there's this idea in this moment of it, there's this sort of moment in history that reveals all these alternative non-rational possibilities, if you grant me that, and then I'll close with this, that are so against how we naturally experience suffering. Get rid of it is the natural thing. It's so naturally against the idea of what we should seek. Jesus puts a question mark beside all success. You say being successful is great. Maybe, maybe not. It's not that Jesus says no. That would almost make it easy. If he said success is necessarily bad, then great, just avoid success. No, he does the same way, just puts a little question mark by it, right? The brain now.
When he said that, I thought, that is exactly right. That is exactly right. I've never been able to sort of put it in words like he did right there. He just puts a question mark by it. And, I deal with this at church. I see this all the time in ministry because there are successful ministries, but in almost every case, the success of something begins to seed its undoing. And this is sort of the pattern of the age of decay. And I had a little chat with Grim Grizz on a live stream because I said, when I read Jesus in the Gospels, I see that he almost says that there are limitations to what can be built in the architecture of this present age, which is why a new age is coming, why a new heaven and new earth, a new creation comes, creation 2.0, And again, the book of Colossians, Jesus is raised into that new creation, and his body, his current body that sits at the right hand of God the Father in heaven, is already a part of that new creation. And so he brings that new creation with him as he brings himself.
Naturally doesn't hold well to question marks. So it is very easy to go, great, just avoid success. No, he does the same way, just puts a little question mark by it, right? The brain naturally doesn't hold well to question marks. So it is very easy to go back into habits or modes of structuring that lead us right back into Babylon. And there has to be this perpetual effort of remembering it. And then a church, I love that point that the church necessarily has to fail. How in the world do you create an institution that has part of its very internal logic, the necessity of realizing that institutions can squash the spirit or lead to quantification that is bad? That contradiction right there seems to have a self-devouring logic. But one of the revelations of Christ is that actually that contradiction, if you will, is actually necessary for keeping the spirit alive. But it is very hard to hold to that, especially in an age where in an age that wants quantifiable results for everything or an explanation for everything, and you can't easily get it. But Jesus says, come and see. Like if you come into it, you can experience it, but you have to enter to experience it. So that becomes the prerequisite, but I'll pause with that.
Okay, there's a couple of things I want to say. And one is the second session of Luke's course is called Christ is Not the Church. So that's very interesting in light of what you gentlemen are talking about. And then I thought of, again, Ivan Illich, who is one of my favorite Christian thinkers, saying that the church is, when the church is a she, not an it, then it's performing its correct.
Of course, talking about this stuff is always difficult because the church is the body of Christ. The church is the bride of Christ. The church, Jesus gives them the command in the book of Acts, Acts 1, you will be my witnesses. That I think is a better, people always look to the end of Matthew. Great Commission's fine, but I think in English it doesn't quite, baptizing, discipling. I think all, the Spirit is going to be given to you, and you will be my witnesses. And this is where you get into this question mark, because you can, when I talk to people about this whole messianic question, they will look at Jesus and say, Jesus wasn't successful. Well, why wasn't Jesus successful? Well, people around Jesus said, well, Romans are clearly in charge, and Herods are clearly in charge. And for Jesus to be successful, we should see something like David and Solomon. And I think the answer to that is, saw David and Solomon. Was that enough? Was it enough? Was it long lasting? Could it endure? And so what Jesus brings in is, in some ways, still like David and Solomon. It never fully arrives, but it is still making progress towards
function, but it becomes an it, right? So the other thing I just wanted to be personal for a second, because I was thinking of my own story and how as a troubled young man, I kind of came against Christ, in a visionary sort of a way, and I rejected that. And then over time, I've developed more, let's say, love of Christian, scripture and teachings. And even though I've already made my commitment to another religion, so it's interesting how let's say the truth that the Christ is bringing to the world is a slow percolating thing, 2,000 years. And maybe if we're going to Luke's way of looking at it, it's way older than that. Older than, even Christ, the Nazarene man, the Rabbi Jeshua, or whoever he was, the person who existed in that historical moment. There's something older than that, perhaps. So anyway, those are a few thoughts that I had as I was listening to you, gentlemen.
Well, Christ is not the church. And I had a similar maybe story to you, Andrew. I grew up as a Christian, And I found myself as a young man seeing all the hypocrisy of the church. And so I rejected Christianity, but it was more the institutionalization of it, not Christ. But it took me a long time to realize I wasn't rejecting Christ.
So, and this is where I think Protestants tend to have an advantage, because even people who, let's say, are worshiping and participating and are members of Orthodoxy and Catholic, I think they are using their church Protestantly, because there is a commitment to the institution that seems essential to definitely Catholicism, perhaps Orthodoxy, by virtue of apostolic succession, where Protestants tend to locate, certainly they locate it in some ways in terms of fidelity to Scripture, but Protestants tend to locate it in terms of the presence of the Spirit, not necessarily tethered to a tradition like apostolic succession.
I was rejecting everything that had been built around it. Not saying it was bad, but going to Jordan's point, it will inevitably fail. And so there's this real question for me, what's able to reconcile that tension between Christ and the church? And really there's a question, what was able to reconcile that tension in me between Christ and me, which is in a sense a small church, a very failed man with all sorts of
You saw the move right there that he made.
faults and shortcomings, and leaning towards kind of Gurdjieff here. In a sense, the only force that can really reconcile that at a very deep level is the force of remorse, is when I see I'm not where I should be, how far away I am from the example of Christ, how far away I am from being the man that I wish to be, or the husband or the brother or whatever. And so in a sense, where often the churches have failed is they put themselves above Christ rather than under him. And they don't come to that sense of needing to feel that deep remorse that we have strayed in some way, shape, or form. How do we constantly keep returning back to the way, the truth, and the life? No institution, no person has that. And so that's very interesting for me, because there's this fractal effect, in a sense, that the macrocosm and the microcosm kind of relate here. How does Christ and the church, how do Christ and I begin to reconcile? Because if his presence is always here, the Alpha and the Omega, if he has always been and always will be, then there is something that is constantly pressing up against me, a knock at the door that's always needing some attention. And I don't see it as being one of trying to affirm or resist, but being able to reconcile. And that's very, very difficult. So there's something in here, and I see it almost in the Christian world at the moment, this kind of a competition to be right. Who's on the right path? Who has the right church? Who has the
Christian YouTube, and it's not new to YouTube.
You know, we are right, which spells out war. But if I feel as though if every Christian could come and willingly move towards that remorse, which requires a seeing of how far away I am, not how close I think I am to Christ, then maybe that might be the necessary fuel, if you'd like, the necessary oil, the lubricant that might help to all Christians and non-Christians, let's just say everyone, to begin to relate in a different way. We're all small. We're all tiny. We're all very, very kind of temporary on this planet. And so this is this inversion. This is this turning the world upside down. We're not fighting for Christ, in a sense. We're wishing Christ to be here on earth with us so he can help us. Or we cannot help ourselves. And that's humbling, because that is filled with the death pangs of egoism. I need to let go. I need to lose my life in order to gain it. It sounds easy in words, but after 52 years, man, it is fucking hard.
Nice. So now that we're properly lubricated, it's I feel like there's like a two really fun rotations. One, let me just I want to put an image up there. Of It's Fucking Hard. I don't have the appropriate accent to make that language land. So, you get the image of when I was a kid, and I was wounded in some fashion. I fell off my skateboard. I had tore up my leg. There were two things that were going to happen that I really didn't want to participate in, but nonetheless were going to happen. One was some kind of extremely painful cleansing was going to happen of the wound, whatever it happened to be, hydrogen peroxide, I think, in my experience most often. And then second, the wound was going to be bandaged, which meant that at some point in the future, the bandage is going to have to come off. And for the most part, everybody's had that experience. And just, be a 5-year-old and have to be present to the searing pain of the alcohol sometimes poured on your wound, or the momentary unpleasantness of having the Band-Aid ripped off. Now here's the thing. And then just map that to everything. Because as you say, this movement of humility is like having your entire identity ripped off. And being poured with a cleansing agent, the salvation, the salve that will definitely hurt in the process of it cleaning. So that's one image. And then the second image is, Andrew, you mentioned something like you've already chosen to follow or participate in another religion. But I remember being very taken early in my journey here by reading a book, For the Love of the World, or For the Life of the World, For the Life of the World, by a Russian Orthodox theologian, Shmeman, where he points out that Christianity isn't properly a religion. And in fact, it's precisely to the degree to which Christians take Christianity as a religion that they immediately set against each other in fighting about who knows more about the true religion.
It's so interesting because James Wood in the Tim Keller video will talk about that, because when I got into Keller in 2006 to 2008, Keller was really working hard on the prodigal son and religion and not religion. And this is something that, again, comes up again and again and again in Christianity.
They each are holding. And this is a very weird thing to say, but you can actually work backwards and say, look, we're present to reality. And we might say that it is best for us to be truly present and fully present to reality, to be able to engage with what is real on the basis of what is real, and delude ourselves not at all, and in fact become increasingly intimate with what is real. And that's exactly the same thing. It's, Christ is saying that, do that. Now, of course, he says, I am the way, because when we speak about Christ, we have this paradox again. On the one hand, we have an image of an actual person, a biological Homo sapiens sapiens born of woman. And this is true. But on the other hand, we also have the Logos. John does that. The Word was made flesh. And the Logos is useful for us to meditate on. Because the notion of the Logos in the West, which maps, by the way, the word would also mean the Tao in the East, is the principle by which all of these kinds of things, like the ability for me to be in relationship with the world, the fact that's possible at all, the name we give to that possibility is the Logos. So if you work in the direction of just simply committing yourself to a fully intimate, fully present relationship with reality, you will discover at a certain point that you are by necessity doing so by means of primary relationship with the Logos. And then when you discover that the logos is not an it, but a he, as we talked about, the church is not an it, but a she, then you're finding yourself face to face with the revelation of Christ. So this is a very tough thing. You know, if you put Christianity on a bookshelf next to, you know, you do the perennial thing, which is to say, by the way, you are in fact actually a modernist. You're operating in modernity, and you say, okay, I've got a.
Now, what's so interesting about this is the middle guy here, Peter Lightheart, wrote this really interesting book called Against Christianity, where he's making very similar argument to what Jordan Hall is making, that once you talk about Christianity, you have already sort of led into an abstraction. And the Bible doesn't talk about that abstraction. The Bible talks about Christ. The Bible talks about
Bunch of different ideologies that are in books, and people might choose to follow their ideologies as a way of sort of running the operating system of how they choose to behave and how they boot up their moral structures and how they create their table of values and how they, you know, interact with each other. I can kind of pick them off, and they're all sort of like different ones, most of which have developed over time historically in cultures. And you say, yeah, one of them happened to develop in this synthetic movement from Jerusalem out to Athens and then through the Roman Empire in a historical moment. It'll look like it's another religion, but the proposition is that every single piece of that conversation is already happening inside a context known as reality. And Christ is the way that you can enter into relationship with reality, a very different kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. And I would say that church religion is provisional. It's not the ultimate truth. All of it is provisional. Now, even the words are provisional, like they point to the truth, but they're still the logos. Like my original objection to Christianity was it was a bunch of people telling me stuff. And my original attraction to Buddhism was I can sit quietly and listen to the Holy Spirit on a meditation cushion, right? So I there was nobody shouting at me and telling me what was true, right? So that was very, 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 very attractive. And I don't think that's the essence of Christianity or Buddhism or anything else. Anybody's proposition about what reality is, you know, is anything ultimate. But that's not quite, I don't think that's quite postmodernism either, because I think there is a Holy Spirit, there is divine nature, there is love, etc. So, yeah.
It's definitely not postmodernism.
and you know what Andrew said is so true, because so I just did a rando with Michael Sartori's father. Now, watching these old randos, I was in I was in those days sort of just flying blind, and when I listened to a lot of the stuff I was talking, I was just you were basically getting a lot of the stuff that I had just developed over years of ministry that was just sort of um, but I know so many of what people have wrestled with. And so when I'm listening to Michael's father talk, I knew a whole bunch of you that are going to be triggered by the guy, boomer, because he's an evangelical, and the categories that he uses, story that he tells. And so, and he's a talker. So he's talked through, he told his story well. And he was, especially someone of that age, I was really impressed that he did share truth about his younger years. And because, especially for someone from that culture and that time, I mean, it's sort of a shameful thing. It's hard to tell publicly. And so I really respect that he did. But towards the end, then, I really wanted to push a similar point to what Andrew had just made, because to one degree or another, we sort of have to see things for ourselves. Now, in Christian terms, we talk about this often as the work of the Holy Spirit. And this is why, I don't make Christians. I can't do this for people. Now, people who have exceptional gifts like Tim Keller preaching, many people would have that happen right there in the chair. And that's just a powerful spiritual gift that's actually rather uncommon. And part of it is the one who has the gift, like Keller. And sometimes it's just the work of the Holy Spirit. Someone takes a sermon that isn't, getting any action anywhere else, and bang, and I'm continuing to make my way through the book Spellbound. And one of the things that you see again and again is, again, it's the experiential that in many ways is sort of undeniable for us.
No, I think well put. And I think it was Keller who, when he talks about John and in the beginning was the word, and word is logos, and logos is meaning of life, quote unquote. And then what's interesting is logos is a person. So the very means of intelligibility with reality must be personal. It must be relational. It must be lived. You cannot understand reality from some sort of abstract principle. It has to be personal. And thus you get into things where personal knowledge is most fundamental. But then, of course, the question is, what is a person? What exactly is the person? And to be like Christ is to somehow participate and inhabit in that question. Which, again, it's funny because it makes me think of, I think it was Walker Percy who said something like a novel is a metaphor that can be put no other way. You have to get all 500 pages to get it, in order to get that way of that grasp on reality. Something similar applies to the logos then. Like the only way to get the logos is to get the whole person of Christ, right? They're a novel that can be said no other way, right? The answer, unfortunately, is not 42. If you go to Panera and say 42, it will not open up some sort of door in the fabric of reality. So there's some sort of participatory knowledge. And of course, there's a bit of a reclaiming of some of the philosophers, a beloved Michel Planier on personal knowledge. There's a coming back of thinkers who were left behind, in my opinion, who very much stressed you cannot get autonomously rational or autonomously abstract understanding. There's always a personal element. I think of Feyerabend and Against Method arguing that a scientific advancement is not an abstract consensus, but some crazy guy named Galileo who's frickin' sure he's right, and he has a passionate love, and he's going to convert everyone. And it's not just the church against Galileo. The scientists are as well. Like everyone is, dang it. But there's some sort of fire that actually, this personal element that cannot be removed. And I think that's extremely important. And so the church question, I go back to this a lot because this one's tricky, right? Because there's this one idea where you say, well, church is corrupt, we don't need it. Yeah, apparently Christ cares about it. Apparently you're supposed to be in community, and you need to. And the other thing that also happens, if you start saying, well, we don't need church because it's fundamentally corrupt, versus it will necessarily fail and we need to be there when it fails, that's a different relation. When you say, well, church always fails, therefore I won't go, versus church always fails and I'm still going. If we don't do that, I think the world ends up, what we're seeing is what I like to call global hikimorism, this spread of these people that don't leave the apartment in Japan. And it has many forms of it.
I think this, I really enjoyed OG Rose, Daniel Gardner, in this video. I know he talks fast and he's got a ton of energy, but I really enjoyed him. I really enjoyed what he said.
It could be the incel, the hikikomori, and different people, because you're always about to go see your neighbor. You're always about to go hang out in the community. And but Netflix is on. You just don't quite get there, right? Because people are unpredictable. And what if they say something that makes you question all your life decisions? So, there's something incredibly rational about hikimorism, actually, especially when you can get your food and you can get your entertainment. And basically, a world that lacks personal knowledge rationally ends up in something like hikimorism. And I think we increasingly see that more and more. And then the money doesn't go toward the communal services, et cetera, and so forth. So it's very important to stress non-rationally a going out, a being in the community. Now, here's the question. This is what we wrestled with at Eunoia. So Eunoia, that was we called ourselves, Eunoia is loosely translated into beautiful thinking. We had, so it was a church, but we also had on Thursday art galleries, venues. We had an open mic and, all of these different things. And one of the things we kind of talked about is not looking like a church. Because the reason why you don't want to, like, aesthetically, like when you see the building. And the reason for that is because what ends up happening a lot of the times is somebody looks over, sees a giant cross on the window, and then they say, oh, that's not for me. And therefore they don't come in because I'm not Christian, right? And also, it can actually protect the people inside from encountering the atheist and finding out that all your preconceived ideas about the atheist being an immoral, bad person, actually, they're kind of nice. Oh, well, what do I do with that, right? How do I tarry with that reality, right? Well, if you kind of set it up aesthetically to where you never actually have the other encounter you, all your preconceived ideas of us versus them or whatever don't get trampled, which I actually think is very important to trample them to actually get at the higher, if you grant me this, higher revelation that Christ is pointing to, that one would have to get into. But I think there's something more than us versus them dynamics that are at play, right? But if you never actually readily encounter otherness, especially as a community, you're never kind of motivated to actually go to those next levels, to go beyond, say, to be a theology geek for a moment, the Roman road that Harold Bloom talks about for something more like the King Victus, kingdom-based salvation that you see in kind of new Paulian theology, right? Well, you never have reason to go beyond that, actually, right? So some of the things you try to do, because this actually, to me, gets into structural questions of how the church is done. How do you fail well? How do you die well, as Goodell would put it, right, in the church? How do you go to this place where you fail well, right? Where you have a regular meeting place, because also it's an incredibly powerful thing when you have people who just bring the chili. We just had a meal every Thursday night and people just made it happen, right? And then, we went and fixed floors in Katrina and there were churches all over the world. I mean, that's a crazy thing, right? So you don't want to give up that. But you also don't want to do church in a manner, because this is what I'm getting at. You also don't want to do church in a manner that just becomes people who think like me, people who kind of don't actually make me uncomfortable. And actually, there's a certain kind of wall that's created to keep the world out. But here's the problem. I don't think anyone necessarily intends to do that. It's not like you wake up one day and say, you know what, we want to make sure we don't want to interact with otherness. What ends up happening is that habits form, structure is made.
I really love this rant. It is so, so true. Now, again, I'm only 42 minutes into this and it's like an hour and 45. There's so much good stuff in this video. I can't cover it. I just don't have the time for it.
Where you don't regularly encounter otherness, right?
Mhm.
And so what we tried to do is, well, we tried to base it on the arts and made people feel like, yes, you can come sing songs that are not explicitly Christian. There will be explicitly Christian songs, but really we're seeking.
And his church thing is very TLC. There's definitely some estuary DNA in what he's doing.
So this is the issue. Really, we're seeking excellence that points toward beauty. I think the church really gets in trouble without the concept of beauty, because then what you're stuck in is either the good or the true. And when you're stuck in those, aren't these people immoral and don't they have a lie? So there's no benefit to relating with them. But if there is something about otherness and learning to tarry with negativity and actually be in the presence of the other who doesn't think like you, that actually will then force you to actually learn how to be Christ-likeness versus just fight them with the sword and get rid of them. If that is a unique condition of possibility to bring forth something like beauty, of which attracts people into transformation versus guilt them into change, well, then it is very difficult, I think, to deal or think of a church that is not going to more on the side end up in institutional problems than not. Now, of course, that all has to be expanded on, but I think about this a lot. I definitely, as a Christian, wrestle with the challenge of, okay, Christ isn't the church, but let's not throw out the church. But shouldn't we? Because all they ever do is mess up. No, that's not what he says. But how do we do it so we don't end up in us versus them dynamics? I think it's a real problem, but I think it's definitely something we have to think.
And we always do wind up with these same problems, but you can't stop. And so, I mean, when I talk about, the crisis my own little church is in terms of viability, and I mean, there are different elements to that, and every church has its own sort of way of trying to live in the world. But still, I thought he said it. I thought he said it very well in the very unique way that he speaks.
So, yeah, I agree. Actually, rather completely. What I was seeing was maybe three different echoes of that. One echo is if you withdraw from the church because the church will fail and is corrupt, you also withdraw from the world. This is the whole let me hunker down.
And that's just such a great point. It's like, I'm not going to go to the church because there's hypocrites there. Oh, tell me where there aren't. I mean, are you not going to go anywhere? And this again gets back to exactly what people are doing. They're pulling in the walls, and oh, Chat GPT, they'll always say nice things to me. Not a real, not a real human being, because real human beings are a mess. But a computer that's programmed to only just tell me exactly what I want to hear.
Sin no more on my own little 2 by 2 foot square and wait for the end to come, because that's sort of the only thing that's worth doing in this life. Of course, that's also not what he says. So, but then I can make that more personal, which is, this is also true of being a father, for example. Like, you will definitely fail. You will definitely fail. And the worst part about it is that, and it will hurt. In fact, it will hurt maximally, because the more deeply you invest yourself in loving another, this other happens to be your child, but they are very specifically, precisely another, the more profoundly it will hurt. Right? That's just how it works. And so the same thing with the church, right? So you get this switch. If you choose not to invest in something with that level of vulnerability, that guarantees that its failure will hurt, then you will find yourself withdrawing. And that move is exactly the wrong move. And so then you have to force yourself to say, okay, this is sort of the mirror of the other side, suffering. That's meaningful suffering. The meaningful suffering is to enter into these relationships of profound meaning, which, of course, as you say, the logos, right? The person of meaning, profound meaning, which then will fail, because we are finite creatures in a finite and sinful world, and that will hurt. And that is part of the lesson. That's part of the discipleship, is entering into that on a continuing basis. I think I had one more image, but trying to get that last part out made it too ripply. So maybe it'll come back. But I wanted to punt. I want to punt something up in the air that I thought that Luke would be able to slam dunk. But oh well, too late. Maybe it'll come back.
Well, I was thinking maybe when Daniel was speaking about, just the intense loneliness of the present moment without communal living at all, isn't it kind of obvious why people are going back to church? Like, why, there's been this sort of question in the media, why are people doing it? Like, but isn't that what people long for, is communion? And the other thought I had was, when I was walking on the beach in Brittany and I was looking at how beautiful the culture was when such things like churches existed, how much beauty there was in the streets and in buildings. And it's like, oh my God. And that was a time when everybody was going, to some church or other. And that.
Now, this is a very common thought that he's expressing, but it's more complicated, because church attendance goes up and down throughout history. And remember, the church attendance reached its peak in the United States in the 50s and 60s. Its peak. That means that if you go and see these beautiful New England churches, a smaller percentage of people were going to church during the Revolutionary War than like before in the First Great Awakening, after in the Second Great Awakening. When you go to Italy and you see these amazing cathedrals, you look at the Cathedral of Milan, it's just like, wow, what a cathedral. You can go up on the roof and you can look at all the crazy. And then you read the history and you discover that, yeah, it was run by a tyrant. And the tyrant was in competition with all of the other cities, in the major cities in Italy, to have the most beautiful cathedral and to have the best artists. And it's like, this isn't necessarily the fruit of righteousness that we're seeing, but yet this is again part of this really interesting formula of failure, where on one hand, you can look at the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel, I mean, Peugeot and I are very much on the same page. The Sistine Chapel is outright heresy. this portrayal of God the Father as an old man in the sky. It's just outright heresy. It shouldn't be there, but there it is, and it's powerful. And I was talking to someone who made a trip to Italy, and not necessarily a terribly religious person, but she went into the Sistine Chapel and she found herself weeping because of the beauty. They have a good section about beauty in this video, but I want to get to, I just don't have enough time, which is good for the video. So by all means, go to Andrew's channel, and the link is below in the notes, and like and subscribe and watch the whole conversation, because the conversation is amazing. All right, this is towards the end of the video, but we'll end with this.
Magnificent. So a few things come to mind. The fantastic Ross Bird talks about how we have to understand, a lot of what God is doing with his hiddenness as this tension between inclusion and holiness. Because if he includes you too soon, you are reduced to ash and destroyed. An image I kind of like to go through is maybe Canto 20, 19, Paradiso. So Dante is not happy. Beatrice won't smile. Why won't you smile, Beatrice? And Beatrice is like, buddy, if I were to smile right now at the level you're at, it would reduce you to ash like Simli. And this is fascinating because it suggests that Dante's not out of the woods. Ain't he in Paradiso? He came out of Inferno. There's actually still something to learn. So you could look at hell as good, learning, not falling into evil or sin and doing the good, okay? But actually in the Paradiso, that's not enough. There's actually a certain development that is still required, right? I like to talk about Lovecraft with the parentheses around craft, right? Like if you're dealing with beauty, because that's what Beatrice ultimately is, if you're dealing with God, you're dealing with something incredibly dangerous, because if you're not ready for it, it destroys you. So literally in Christianity or in holiness, there is still actually a developmental or work that needs to be done actually so that you are not destroyed by holiness. You're not destroyed by God, that you're not reduced to ash. And that becomes the challenge of the Christian, you could say, right? Is actually, how do you come to handle more of Beatrice's smile? How do you come to handle a reality where it's the Grand Canyon without knowing what it is? I mean, wouldn't that fry your brain if everything you experience was without a category to understand it? I mean, that's a high demand, right? Well,
Yeah.
that is what's being suggested in Dante, that you're actually supposed to get in the, obviously at the end where the wings fail the lofty fantasy, there's a suggestion that this can go on forever. And actually this is what you were made for and enjoy. And that's where you find enjoyment, is this ever development of a capacity to get the fullness of things. I think it's at the end of Narnia where Lewis is like, yeah, New Jerusalem is where blue is more like blue, where people are more like people. It's not escaping blueness. It's not going out of the world. It's gaining the Cezannean capacities to actually meet the conditions of the full access of reality and thus shine with it yourself. And that is a lot of this kind of another reason the church, in my opinion, has become painful for many people is because it's in a logic of Inferno and it hasn't moved to the logic of Paradiso. It's helping us not sin, great, but it's not helping us handle more.
My wife often says, you are a seventh grade. The little joke. Excited. This guy's the same way, and I love it. I absolutely love it. He is so taken by what he's talking about, and rightly so, because it's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's true, and he's riffing on it, and he can't sit still. I love it.
Beatrice's smile. Okay, and that's a problem. To me, Gurdjieff, with practices, energy, all the stuff you're talking about is actually in the realm. Like a Christian may hear that and say, well, what's that going to do? It's about handling more of Beatrice's smile. It's about handing more of the Grand Canyon without the pictures. It's about, because here's the other thing, like a way to think about the Torah to the gospel. And somebody said this, maybe I can't remember who, but it's this idea that in the Torah, you could say God is making a people, okay? And they're kind of in a way beautiful because the queen comes in of Sheba, like people are attracted, right? They come in, right? So there's this kind of making of a people that shine, evangelism by shine, attract in, because the evangelism of beauty is shine, not verbal, okay? Now, in the gospel, you can say God sends people out. But there is the assumption that people are still going to be shining and beautiful when they go out, though. It's not that, those are separate things. It's that when you go out, there's still the shine. But here's the issue. The greater if you grant me this, the greater the diversity, pluralism, complexity, distance you go in, the more difficult it is to keep shining, because the more it is you fall into habits you don't mean to, the more you encounter the other that's not intelligible and you don't know how to meet them. So shining becomes really, really difficult. A way I look at Paul, whether it's right or wrong, is in a kind of way, and I wouldn't, I kind of sometimes think about Paul as the Third Testament. And what I mean by that is he's trying to he is live situationally reasoning.
And this is so good, and it's so right about the epistles.
What it would mean like for the Christian to go into, say, Corinth or whatever, be true to the gospel, but also not stupid. Like an example I will make, 1 Corinthians, where he's talking about the food. He's like, okay, everyone, all right, if the pagans are around, don't eat that food on the altar, because they'll think you're worshiping that God, right? But if they're not around, of course you can eat the food, because those powers don't have any power over you, right? So what is this? What is this? This is situationally reasoning. Because if he says the food is fundamentally evil and you can never drink it, well, that's reifying a certain ontology, a certain being that would be very problematic. But then if you just say, well, just carelessly go up and eat there, well, the pagans won't understand it, right? So what is he trying to do? He's situationally reasoning in live situations to figure out the way that the Christian can continue to shine with the gospel and not be unintelligible, right? I actually think we can look at Paul in this sense as a kind of model. I mean, N.T. Wright basically says he invents theology, if you grant that or not. Theology as this kind of creation of situationally reasoning on live metaphysical principles. Because, like, for example, Jesus doesn't tell us what to do with drones, right? He doesn't tell us what to do with drones, but that doesn't mean we can't think about drones in light of Jesus, just using the means of intelligibility and situational reasoning that Paul is putting forth, right? But what is Paul doing? He's talking about sharing the gospel, of course, but also in here there's a notion of shining with the gospel and actually being intelligible in that shine. And simply what I mean by saying Paul sometimes I think of as the Third Testament is because otherwise we can just say, is Paul repeating what Jesus was saying, or it's just kind of, there's kind of this, well, Paul is for adults and the gospel is for kids, but really the real theology is in Paul or whatever. No, Paul is absolutely complementing situationally reasoning in light of the life of Jesus, what to do in live situations, right? And you need to see those things going together, or you get into lots of trouble. Now, I'd have to put meat on those bones, but I don't have any meat right now, so forgive me. But there really is this idea of holiness and inclusion, as Bird puts it, that's very well, and I really suggest his work. That's very important. Now, the tension I think that you get is that nobody means to stop shining, right? Nobody means, they don't wake up one day and say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stop shining, right? What ends up happening is you get into habits, and James K.A. Smith has this lovely book called You Are What You Love. And the idea is that what you love forms your habit. So if you go to the mall and you enjoy it, it's a kind of liturgy, as he describes, it forms a habit. And character is habit, kind of in a virtue ethics sort of thing, and so on and so forth, right? So what ends up happening is we end up loving things that we don't realize we're loving, maybe. We then form habits that we don't mean to form. And we actually then get into a place where we stop shining or participating in this beauty that we are describing and not realizing we're doing it, right? That, to me, when I was speaking with Eunoia having space for otherness, one of the reasons why the church has to have some mechanism of always encountering otherness is because if you cease encountering otherness, then the probability of you falling into habits that cut you off from the world or shining and gets you into intelligible categorizations skyrockets, right? So you need that loving of the neighbor. Who is your enemy? Like, this is nuts. Because if anyone is going to wake you up out of your preset ideas of how the world works, it's your enemy, because they think you're wrong. So the surprise, the encounter, it shatters your categories, right? So you need regular encounter with the enemy in order to have that occur. If the church doesn't have mechanisms by which to genuinely encounter the other or the neighbor or the enemy, it's only a matter of time before it ends up in habits that it doesn't even know it's fallen into, that keeps it into categories of intelligibility that cuts it off from reality in the name of saving it.
And that's exactly why I think churches need to have church-adjacent estuaries, because you need to bring the enemy in, and you need to have a space where they will tell you exactly what they think of you. You need to hear that. If you don't hear that, and if you don't learn to hear that, working on your own defensiveness,
that becomes a very dire matter. So you have to have a means of otherness. The last thing I'll say, okay, but you see, one of the reasons the church doesn't do this, and I think about this all the time with Jesus. Like, Jesus is a Jew. So, and Jesus obviously loves the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It's not like he hates them or anything. Now, he has some stern freaking words, but, it's not like he hates them, right? But what does Jesus constantly do? He constantly appears a heretic. Like, he looks like, he's not washing the hands, his disciples, he's sitting with sinners, so he appears a heretic. I didn't say he is a heretic. I said appears a heretic because he's actually a fulfillment, but they can't make that intelligible. So he has to appear heretical. That to me is part of the secret, dare I say secret, it's in the open, but that's part of the key to this tension of the church not falling into an auto-cannibalistic system that devours everyone, is the church has to always actually be willing to have the courage to appear heretical in, say, interacting with non-Christians or being with non-Christians or doing things that don't fit into the obvious categories of being Christian. Because when you stop appearing heretical, then that means you've made an idol of the categories of intelligibility that thus cuts you off from, I suppose you could say, the icon or the higher horizon, right? Because you have a confirmation theory of truth. You want to confirm that you're a good church. You want to confirm that you're doing what a Christian is. Well, you're cut off from the openness then, right? So there has to be mechanisms of, like, if you have an open mic where people could sing non-explicitly Christian songs, well, you're ashamed of the gospel. You're not spreading the word. You're being a bad Christian, right? Well, those are the things you have to do. Jesus is willing to appear heretical in order to show the way to fulfillment. If we're not willing to, quote unquote, appear heretical because we don't want to be seen as leaving the faith or doing something Jesus wouldn't approve of, there's some wisdom to that concern, because you could take this, but this is where you need beauty, or you need the costly grace versus cheap grace that Bonhoeffer's talking about. Like, you need that entire package to understand that appearing heretical does not mean Paul Tillich, unfortunately, red light district, doing whatever you want because the ultimate concern transcends you from the particularity of your lived experience. That would, Paul Tillich says.
Well, Gurdjieff was extremely is considered a heretic, isn't he?
All right. So wonderful rant. Highly recommend the whole conversation. But when I do that, again, back to what I talked about here, that the truth is we don't think our way out of this, sort of fail forward to it. And that's going to mean, this is why one of the most important videos ever made was, why do simple Christians sometimes outperform sophisticated Christians? Why I do the Freddie and Paul show. Why I stay in this church. Because, boy, when we got a lot of brain power, we got all that brain powder or power to find excuses, to find justification, to find explanations, to find every way to not be faithful. And I have so often found that simple Christians outperform sophisticated Christians because, doggone it, they see in black and white terms, and so they don't always do it well, and they don't always do it right. And there's plenty of simple Christians that are doing really stupid, boneheaded things. But again, we're always failing forward. And simple Christians sometimes fail forward better than those of us with copious amounts of gray matter that just can say all the things and write all the stuff. And when Jesus doesn't say, "A new commandment I give you, that you think your way through this," he says, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you." That you love your neighbor all the way up to and including your enemy, that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. All right, I'm out of time. Leave a comment.